Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Freshagenda. And Steve, we've got a really modest agenda today. We're going to talk about the world as well as this week's GDT and, of course, Chart of the Week.
Yeah. Well, it's a modest agenda. Let's see if I can't stretch it right out like I do. So in our outlook that we mailed at the end of last week, we try to distill in simple terms how the effect of war layers on top of what's already happened to the world coming out of COVID and then the complications of supply chain. So looking at these different impacts that we know are occurring as a result of the war that are making their way to changing food markets profoundly, impacting milk production. And then the ultimate change we think will come in policy in response to the economic pressures that come, and then probably some trade responses.
Sure.
And then where does it end up hitting the consumer in both developed and developing markets? So it is a pretty complicated story, so that this will be a continuing dialogue as we see various things play out. So the big unknowns, I'd say the big things that we have called out, but are huge amounts of speculation everywhere. What's the impact of this reduced fertiliser supply around the world, particularly in Europe in the short term? What's that going to do to milk production? There's already challenges with milk solid content in Europe. This will add to that. And just, what does that do to available milk and available commodities?
Sure.
So they're fairly large effects.
Yeah, and given that weather outlook for Europe, the feed quality is going to be an ongoing issue, isn't it? Going forward.
Absolutely. And then as this reaches consumers, the most exposed consumers are those in developing countries where food prices have risen quickly. Dairy's in that mix, and to what extent dairy demand gets burnt off because of the unaffordability of simply staples in their diet.
Yeah.
So where does dairy fit into that mix? So it's a complicated year ahead.
It certainly is. When we focused on dairy, obviously, but as you say, everything's rising. The cost of everything's rising. So how does that actually impact demand?
Yeah. So what's this story?
Just the small things we think about.
Yeah. And in the background to this event and the lead up, there's been a lot of speculation as to what the restrictions in China do to the use of milk, whether we've seen any increased drying of milk as occurred when COVID broke out.
Sure.
There's the constant reminder that whole milk powder is way undervalued compared to fat and protein values.
We've been talking about that for a long time.
And then there's this thing of, are we just seeing a big protracted game of chicken between the seller and the buyers in that market? Those three things into playing. The futures market has been a lot softer since the last event, which had overshot enormously. And that just represents that after this event, that gap has widened. Hugely.
Yeah.
If you base it on European skim milk powder. Obviously, US product is a bit cheaper. But, look, I think this call about whole milk powder being undervalued, that's great, but it's theoretical, right? It doesn't rise because fat and protein are higher. It meets coincidentally in time to time. Whole milk powder's got its own supply story. It's the bulk of New Zealand production. It can't be avoided. So it's a fact of life.
Yeah.
So if it's undervalued because there's too much on the market and there isn't the demand for the product in that form, it's going to soften. So that's what we've seen again. So it's almost like treated like an injustice. It should be better. It should be higher in price. Why is it so far behind? Well, there's too much of it. Anyway, this week's result. So a bit of a mixed bag, generally down.
Yes.
I've tidied up the whole milk powder averages there because when you factor in the impact of the instant product, some of those individual contracts look rather silly. So this is just a regular pricing. So whole milk down on weaker demand from China. We'll come on to that. Skim milk powder kept going up for the 17th time, but fats were weaker and cheddar kept going on its crusade. Just a bit of background there. The US market generally flat.
Yeah.
since the last event, still going sideways, but everything in Europe is still rising because of that milk situation.
Yeah, so whole milk powder and butter, much stronger in Europe. So we're seeing this divergence in values based on this event.
So China bought significantly less. This is in tonnes. So this will be taken very bearishly by the market going forward. The lowest volume of whole milk powder bought at an auction since, I think, 2016. So that's going to be something to think about. But fats were weaker.
Demand well down there.
Yeah. Well down for both, and it's probably high prices burning that off to some extent. We saw China buy the lowest tonnage of butter I think we've seen, just in the teens of tonnes. But again, AMF much weaker with higher product volumes put on the market for this auction. So it's reached its worst discount to butter in the history of GDT.
Yeah.
Skim milk powder went up for the 17th time, and we saw the New Zealand premium just widen a little bit. And I'm really struggling for interesting things to say about the GDT.
Well, it's interesting, I think, given what we're saying in our outlook about how tight market fundamentals are, that we're seeing this weakening. This is the second negative event in GDT, and it is that, against the context of the market, is it just the gaming of the mechanism that's going on here? So we'll watch and see.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot put in. There's a lot, if you like, there's a lot of misunderstanding about GDT, and it's all automatically going to go up because we see other regions being tight. Well, it depends who turns up and who needs product. We say that again.
That's right.
The one interesting thing that did come out is this fact that skim milk powder is priced well above whole milk and reached, historically high levels. The highest since 2015, I think, looking back there, yes. It doesn't, the only interesting thing I could find about this particular instance is that it's happened when the market's at the top, thinking that we're near the top. When you look back at where most of those previous big premiums occurred, they were when the market was well down. Yeah. Either screaming down or, sort of bouncing around the bottom. So that is interesting that we've seen that at a peak.
Sure.
Okay, chart of the week.
Chart of the week, let's go across to the States. And the production data out that just came out for February, pretty interesting. This is actually a chart of 3 months in orange versus 6 months. We've lost the legend there somehow. But interesting, a little less milk available. Fluid continues to trend down. So, that helps manufacturing milk availability a bit. But you can see that most of that available milk is going into cheese at the expense of powder, which again is adding to this tightness in skim milk powder that we're seeing globally, and whey protein concentrates. So just some interesting trends in terms of what's happening in the States, that what milk's available is going into cheese.
That WPC is still pulling a lot of whey solids, which is a long rally in those products, particularly the higher end of those. But this just adds to the global shortage of it. The cheese stuff was quite interesting too, that cheddar output fell. Yeah,
which we kind of associate more with retail a little bit, and Mott's with a bit more of the food service, which again, in the context of higher gasoline prices and perhaps less eating out. Interesting.
Yeah, and that could be having an impact. That's one to watch. We talked about that last time.
Sure.
Your great chart that time too, yeah. All right. Well, that's probably it from us. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.